A lot has happened during the past year and a half at WNL, in the nation, and of course across the globe. During times of upheaval and stress, the values that feel most important to us can become clearer, or they can change. The Mudd Center's program this year will focus our attention on daily ethics. That's how, or if, our personal values are actually manifested in the actions and decisions of our daily lives. Since our habits cumulatively shape our lives and the world around us, we'll think together about the impact of our daily ethics as well. The Daily Ethics Lecture Series will include 10 distinguished speakers from different disciplinary and professional backgrounds. They'll address big questions like defining a meaningful life and making a difference, using information and constructing knowledge in our lives, navigating the responsibilities of being a citizen in our communities, of a nation, the world, and the earth. I think the WNL community will be inspired by how our speakers' personal values have been manifested in their professional choices and activities as well. The Daily Ethics Mosaic Project is an especially exciting part of our program this year. The Mudd Center is partnering with the Stanier Gallery and with the artist Jonathan Lee to offer a series of workshops this fall that will culminate in the production of a large-scale community artwork. After so much isolation, the prospect of working on a community project together feels great. The Mosaic workshops will involve individual art making as well as collaborative art making. So students, staff, and faculty will have a chance to think deeply about their own values and choices, and also discuss and create a collective product. I can't wait. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yep. All right. I'm Carla Murdoch. I'm director of the Mudd Center for Ethics, and I'm happy today to introduce the third speaker in our Daily Ethics program this year. The Daily Ethics series is built to prompt our introspection and our discussion about the values that are most important to us. We have a lecture series that serves that aim, and then we also have the Daily Ethics Mosaic project that some of you have participated in. So far in the lecture series, we've heard from two distinguished lecturers so far. Cheshire Calhoun, the philosopher, discussed features of a responsible person who does the right thing by following moral duties and leading a virtuous life. She pointed out that leading a moral life is not only about deciding in our own minds how things ought to be, but also navigating all the complexities of practicing morality in a social context. The journalist and public historian Jelani Cobb then expanded upon our consideration of social morality. He encouraged us to apply a diagnostic understanding of history, which illuminates the fragility of democracy and the necessity of collective and sustained action to uphold democratic principles of equity and justice. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Chignell. He's the Laurance Rockefeller Professor at Princeton University, where he works in the university's Center for Human Values, as well as the departments of religion and philosophy. In recent years, Professor Chignell's scholarship has focused on the ethics of eating. His co-edited book, called Philosophy Comes to Dinner, presents a range of arguments regarding morally responsible food production and consumption. He's also co-produced a massive open online course called The Ethics of Eating that I highly recommend. Today, his lecture will address what to do when you don't make a difference. So welcome, Professor Chignell.
Thanks. No, it's okay. Kant just inserted himself in this. Okay. Yeah. Is this on? Is it working? Okay. All right, there we go. So yeah, Kant appeared unbidden. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks to Carla Murdoch. Thanks to Aaron Taylor, my friend and former colleague at a previous university. Thanks to the Mudd Center for hosting. Thanks to all of you for coming out. Yes, so this is the title of the talk, which I thought would fit your theme of daily ethics. Seems like a lot of what we do on a daily basis doesn't seem to make much of a difference. So in light of that, what should we do? And here's Kant again. The reason I put Kant up there is not to your relief, because I'm going to now go into a disquisition about the first critique. That's the other thing that I like to work on, and Kant will reappear later in the talk in various ways. But what's kind of curious about Kant he's curious in many respects, but he thinks that there are three really key questions in philosophy. This one's not so much of a surprise. What can I know? Epistemology, philosophy of science, theology to a certain extent. He thinks we can't really know or prove anything about the existence of God and has all these arguments against such things. So that's pretty familiar. And then, of course, what should I do? Ethics, value theory, the psychology of moral behavior. But his third question is what is kind of curious and unique. He says the third and in some sense most important question in philosophy for him, the one that brings the first two together, is the question, what may I hope? What am I permitted to hope? The German word there is dürfen. What am I allowed to hope? And it's sort of supposed to combine the two because, because he's going to suggest that he wants to know what you can hope when you've recognized what you can't know, but you still do what you ought to do. So already there's a hint that what you can hope is going to go beyond what you can know, but it has to be somehow tied in an important way to what you do, or when you do what you ought to do. So that's the Kantian kind of background to some of this stuff. The other thing is this interest that came kind of, like all professors work really hard as graduate students, and do these obscure things because, science and the production of new information is very hard and we're very specialized. So you write on things like 2 pages or 2 paragraphs of the Critique of Pure Reason, and then you get tenure, and then suddenly you're like, why is my life meaningful? And you start teaching things that have a much broader interest and import. And I, partly because my friend, this guy down here, Matthew Halteman, is a kind of vegan activist, encouraged me to at least teach some of the arguments about animal ethics and food ethics, and I started teaching it, and then we did the MOOC that Carla mentioned, and then we edited this book, and now I write a little bit about it too. So this talk is an effort to kind of bring together 2 long-standing interests of mine. The plan is to warm up a little bit, not by talking about food, but by talking about climate change. So maybe warm up and boilerplate weren't the best words to use for climate change, but we'll start that way and then move to a brief history of the concept of hope and try to distinguish it from optimism. I think sometimes these 2 things get conflated, and it's important to distinguish the 2. And then we'll look at a sketch of an account of what we may hope, so what's permitted to hope and when you're permitted to hope, and end with some broadly Kantian moral arguments for a few kinds of what I'll call lived hope that are compatible with not optimism but pessimism regarding our predicament in the Anthropocene. Okay, you should have a handout. The handout I won't sort of refer to much directly, and we won't get to this stuff until a little bit into the talk, but there are a few somewhat more complicated things that I thought you'd like to have with you instead of it disappearing as slides disappear. Okay, so this is the boilerplate, and we don't need to spend too long on this because we all know some of the disturbing facts about the Holocene having ended, at least by some people's estimations, around 1945, and this new epoch, the Anthropocene, the epoch of humanity, taking over. Why did the coiners of this phrase, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer, decide to talk about the Anthropocene? Well, because anthropos, the humanity, is as powerful now as a geologic force. So the Earth has been around for billions of years and had all these eras and epochs. We are now affecting with nuclear blasts the lithosphere itself, in addition to, of course, the stratosphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere. So we are very much leaving our mark on the Earth, for better or for worse. There are some debates about when exactly to start the Anthropocene, but most people start it around the age of nuclear power and nuclear explosions. It became part of the popular parlance in the early 2010s. This is a famous article by Oliver Morton, 2011, in The Economist. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of journal articles as well as newspaper articles using this phrase to invoke something like the scary fact about our climate and geologic predicament, given the way in which we've used the Earth's resources. So we know what some of the reasons are. We're using a lot of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. We're emitting it. We're emitting methane. We are potentially warming the Earth to the point where there will be a 6th great extinction. We are also getting to the point where there could be negative feedback loops. The Siberian methane somehow becomes freed and thereby adds yet more, even more powerful greenhouse gases to the environment, thereby allowing things to sort of spin out of control. So we know about all of this, and it's alarming. The IPCC suggests that even if we do something about it in the next 100 years and reduce way down, it'll take a while to stabilize. The temperature will take centuries to stabilize, and the sea levels will keep going up for several millennia due to both ice melting and thermal expansion. Already burned since the Industrial Revolution, 2,100 billion tons of CO2. This I just don't even know what to make of. Like, I read this and think, I don't understand, but this New York Times article says that the heat accumulating in the Earth because of human emissions is roughly equal to the heat that would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima bombs exploding across the planet every day. I checked it again today to make sure that's what it said, and that's what it said. And they cited a scientific article in support of it. But even if we don't know what to make of that, we know that we're trying to stay under the 2-degree Celsius guardrail. There's a 50% chance of doing that if we only burn 1,600 billion tons, having already burned 2,100. 75% chance if we can limit it to 700 billion tons. Unfortunately, proven reserves, so the ones we already know we have, are way up there close to 3,000 billion tons. And these sorts of stranded assets are such that humans are not so good about leaving them in the earth, especially when there's $15 to $20 trillion worth of them there. Okay, so the depressing facts about climate change. We also know that industrial animal agriculture, plant agriculture too, but animal agriculture contributes a great deal to this problem. Greenhouse gases emitted by the animal sector, at least according to one UN report, are greater than the entire transportation sector. That's in part because methane is a much worse greenhouse gas than CO2, though it does break down more quickly in the air than CO2 does. Also, we're eliminating a lot of carbon sinks in the form of forests in order to clear the land, especially in South America, to have the cattle down there or to grow soy and corn for the animals to eat. So industrial animal agriculture as one of the main contributors to the problem. And here are the results. I sort of like this one. It's far away, Silicon Valley, but I just like it because it shows you, even if we get just a 55-inch sea rise over the next couple hundred years, what is now Google, Facebook, Stanford, Yahoo, I don't know if that exists anymore, Cisco, Oracle, all those things are inundated by water, the very tech industry that was supposed to save us from these sorts of things. Here's San Francisco out on the peninsula, that's 25. So if we do around the guardrail, 2 degrees centigrade, we get this, 25 feet. This is all rough and controversial, obviously. You all know this is like not precise science, but it's just a sort of gesture. So we lose some really cool neighborhoods up here. Basically the mission's gone. Here's what happens if we let it go to 4 degrees, 5 degrees, something like that, and lose basically all of Antarctica. That would be 200 feet. And we now have the San Francisco archipelago with, I don't know, Haight Inlet and Castro Bay instead of the Castro. So it starts to look pretty grim. Here's more locally, 20 feet around here. We're okay, or you're okay here in Lexington, but a lot of the people on the coast aren't doing so well. Here's 200 feet. That's just like mass mayhem and disaster. And it's not just here, it's also up in New York as well. Okay, so we know all this stuff. What are our options? Business as usual. We could just let it go. Maybe it goes over the guardrail up to 4 degrees, 8 degrees. World Bank thinks we just don't even know if a 4-degree world is even possible given refugee crises, resource collapse, probably food system collapse would be one of the first things. Innovation, so the Silicon Valley people we just looked at are maybe going to be able to save us. Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil and also former Secretary of State, once said that climate change is not something to panic about, it's just an engineering problem. 2 guys in some garage in Silicon Valley will figure out a way to blast sulfites into the air that will somehow reflect the sun's rays in a different direction and we'll be fine. So that's a kind of techno-optimist, innovative approach. There's this sort of drastic revolutionary approach, like we just have to stop altogether and maybe the poorer countries should be allowed to keep burning a little bit, but we just have to completely change our entire lifestyle, and that's the only way forward. And then there are all these middle ways, sometimes called the good Anthropocene or the soft landing Anthropocene. Stuart Brand is a famous environmentalist who's now become a kind of techno-optimist, calls himself a tragic optimist, who thinks that, yeah, near-term problems, but we will figure out ways, which might involve changing nature quite a bit, might involve allowing for the die-off of lots and lots of species, changing the atmosphere in certain ways using chemicals and so forth. People say, oh, well, we shouldn't play God. That's sort of messing with nature. And he famously says, look, we already are in the Anthropocene as gods, and we might as well get used to it. Okay, what's the goal? there's a lot of doomsaying there. What would be a goal that we might think we have with respect to emissions in the future, the near future, the far future? Some people speak in terms of emissions justice. What does that mean? Try to stay under 2 degrees. I mean, in Copenhagen, they told us to try to stay closer to 1.5. We'll see what they say in Glasgow next week, given that a lot of countries aren't getting close to meeting their promises, including our country. Stay around 2 degrees and then distribute what we have left to burn, sort of climate credits to poorer countries who haven't yet had a chance to burn their fair share. So that might be one thing we could be working towards, but does what you do today, tomorrow, does me flying back to Princeton on Saturday really make a difference? Should I have driven or biked or something down here? How should we think about our daily ethics in light of this sort of catastrophic story, as well as this sort of goal, insofar as something like this is our goal? So that's kind of what I want to now focus on. One interesting question, and I won't go far into this here, but is to whom do we have the obligations to go for emissions justice? So it's like, there are some implications now and people being affected now, but really we're thinking about not even your kids, but maybe your grandkids, their kids. So there are interesting philosophical questions about obligations to future possible people, but people that don't yet exist. Interesting in part because philosophers and ethicists generally don't typically think that we have obligations to non-existent possible people. And it would get really weird if we think we did. I mean, would we then have an obligation to produce as many of those possible people as we could? That would be strange. I mean, we don't think of birth control as a weapon of mass destruction. It's not like, oh, all those possible people haven't been created and so we're doing something wrong, right? So what is the obligation here exactly that we're thinking we have? Maybe it's to nature or something about sustainability or leaving the world as good as we found it, or maybe biodiversity, but there are interesting philosophical questions here. Other interesting philosophical questions have to do with the collective nature of this massive problem. So if we want emissions justice, we recognize that even if we try, a lot of other people probably aren't going to cooperate. At least I don't know if they're going to cooperate. And so it starts to look like a really bad game theoretic situation where you're not just unclear whether the other person is, like in a prisoner's dilemma, whether they're going to defect or not, but you're pretty sure they're going to defect. And so you start feeling a bit of demoralization and pessimism about how things are going to work out going forward, given just how much cooperation would need to take place across nations and demographics. That seems almost unimaginable. Okay, that was depressing, so now I'm going to turn the page to something that at least is a little bit, if not optimistic, then hopeful. So I now want to turn and think about hope a little bit and how that might help us think about confronting these sorts of bleak predicaments in our everyday lives, as well as our sort of longer trajectories and careers. So a brief history, this is the word in Greek for hope. It can be translated as either hope or optimism or expectation. And that's sort of an interesting problem in the history of elpistology, if you will, so the history and philosophy of hope. Does anyone know what this image, whoops, let's go back. This image refers to? Who is this? Pandora, right. So Hesiod's Works and Days has a story about Zeus is annoyed with us, sends a box of curses, tells Pandora not to open it. Like Eve in the Hebrew tradition, Pandora, the woman responsible for all these ills, opens the box, and it's a bunch of curses, and they come out and they're now visiting their evils upon humanity for the rest of time. Peers a little bit, ruefully into the box to see if there's anything else left. And there's this little thing in the corner, and it's elpis, it's hope. Not clear in Hesiod what we're supposed to think about hope. Is it something that Zeus gave us in order to kind of comfort us in light of all the other evils and curses that have been released? Or is it just another much more subtle curse that Zeus also wanted to visit upon us? Euripides and Plato seem to think the latter. Nietzsche expresses it best, perhaps, when he says, Zeus didn't want man to commit suicide, no matter how much the other evils might torment him, but rather to go on letting himself be tormented. To that end, Zeus gives man hope. So ambivalence about hope in the Greek Stoic tradition, we see this in Aristotle, who says elpis is the dream of a waking man, and that the youth are too easily led astray by it. We see it in the Stoics and Seneca, who says you have to cease to hope, only then will you cease to fear, cultivate tranquility, for that alone can make no man wretched. In the Christian period, in the medieval period, we've got theologians like Augustine incorporating hope into the theological story about God infusing virtues into us that are good things. So no more ambivalence in at least the Christian part of the medieval tradition. But it's typically, it doesn't really look like hope. It's this kind of almost faith-like thing that's directed towards the afterlife. Aquinas has got something like that as well. We'll see later that Aquinas has he's got two accounts. The account of it as not the theological account, but the account of it as a passion looks a lot more like what I think we typically regard hope as, and so I'll return to Aquinas later on. The conflation between hope and expectation, or hope and optimism, that I said you find in elpis and even space, the Latin term, is continued in the English tradition, in the early modern tradition, by people like Thomas Hobbes, who says, hope is an appetite with the opinion of attaining. So if you think you're going to attain it and you want it, that's what it is to hope. Locke says hope is that pleasure of mind which everyone finds in himself upon the thought of a probably future enjoyment. So probable. Maybe we have to worry a little bit about what they meant by probability in the 17th century, but that looks like a little more like expectation or optimism. You think you're going to get it, it's probable, and it's something you want. Descartes, that was Descartes. I just read Locke's statement. Locke says that thing about the probable future enjoyment. Descartes says something similar. We shall obtain that which we desire. There is much probability in this. I confused my dead white guys there. So that's Descartes, that's Locke. And this is Spinoza, who returns us to the ambivalence of the Stoics, saying hope is a joy inconstant arising from the idea of something future or past about the occurrence of which we doubt. From this it follows that there is no hope unmingled with fear, and he counsels us against both hope and fear in favor of something more like Stoic tranquility. So we have both the ambivalence of the tradition, is it good, is it bad, should we avoid it, should we cultivate it, and this conflation where it looks like hope is being used to mean something more like what we would call expectation or optimism. The OED continues, maybe influenced by these English philosophers in particular, what I think of as this conflation, so to my chagrin, defining hope as expectation. So hope is the expectation of something you desire. Hope is a feeling of confidence. I rarely disagree with the OED. It seems bizarre to do that, but this just doesn't feel right to me. So I want to try to make some distinctions here in our elpistology between wish, though you still want this thing, but you don't think it's possible anymore. So you might want it to be the case that the generals won the game last night, but you know that they didn't. And so you can't say, I know they didn't win, but I still hope that they did. Or they didn't win, but I still hope that they did, right? That sounds wrong. But they didn't win, but I wish that they did. Sounds fine, right? So wish seems more expansive, compatible even with the outcome being impossible, that is changing the past or something like that. I wish that 2 + 2 didn't equal 4. Maybe you can say that. I'm not sure why you would. Sounds better than saying, I hope that 2 + 2 didn't equal 4. That's because it's not even possible, and it looks like hope requires at least the assessment that the thing is possible. But expectation, I think, requires something quite a bit more, just our linguistic, the way we use the term. You expect something, good or bad, that means you think it's more than 50% likely to happen, let's say. So these distinctions are on your handout if you want to take a look. So expectation, and then optimism just being a kind of, well, there's one way to use the term that is kind of, be optimistic. It's a disposition. It's glass half fullism or silver liningism. That's important, and in psychology there's a lot of work on what this disposition amounts to and how it functions for us. Optimism regarding a specific thing, a propositional attitude about a thing, looks to me like the desire for that thing plus the belief that it's probable or even certain. You can expect that the sun will warm the earth tomorrow, possibly too much. You can expect that 2 + 2 will continue to equal 4. So I think of optimism as expectation, but with desire. Expectation isn't always accompanied by desire. You can expect your execution tomorrow, but that doesn't mean you want it. Okay, so these distinctions will be useful going forward. Optimism has a philosophical history. It's an interesting case of a term that was created by a philosopher. So G.W. Leibniz in the 17th century wrote a book. He's German, but he wrote it in French on theodicy. That is the project of defending theos, God, against accusations that the world is a mess. The problem of evil, basically. So Leibniz has a theodicy, and what he does is prove the existence of God using an armchair a priori argument. So now I've got God's existence. If God exists and God is perfect and supreme, then this world must be the best, right? Because a God wouldn't create anything worse than the best. So QED, this is the best of all possible worlds. So he's a theoretical optimist. He's got these theoretical, scientific, metaphysical reasons for thinking that we should expect only the best, at least at the end of the story, and what's going on now might be some means to some end, or in any case, it couldn't have been better than it is on the whole, and we can't see the whole history of the universe and tell how it's going to go, so we should just be humble about it. Okay, so the best of all possible worlds. Some of you will know that Leibniz himself died a pretty horrendous death. Well, maybe you won't know this. So he had a kind of gangrene that slowly came up his legs, and he was writing constantly and didn't want to stop. And so he also invented lots of things like calculators and so forth himself. So he had a wooden tourniquet that he would just like twist every once in a while in order to dull the pain and make it possible for him to continue sitting at his desk writing, and ended up dying this horrible, painful death, but always convinced that this is the best that things could possibly be. If that wasn't enough, then in 1755, after his death, Europe experienced a cataclysmic event. Can anyone guess what city this is, 1755? Lisbon, the famous Lisbon earthquake, 9.0 on the Richter scale. How do we know that? Is there they must be guessing, I don't know. Allegedly 9.0 on the Richter scale. And for the pious, it was even worse because it occurred on November 1st, so we're almost to the anniversary, and at 10:30 in the morning, when all the good Christians were in church, many of which collapsed. So there's the churches collapsing on their heads, killing them all, or allowing them to run out down to the port, that's down here where they were collecting the wounded. 45 minutes after the earthquake, we get the tsunami, which inundates everybody in the port, fires throughout the city, 80% of the city destroyed, 1/3 of the populace killed, all in a day. Okay, so then that starts to look like it's hard to square with this being the best of all possible worlds, and of course, Voltaire, this is what I was saying, some of you will know, Voltaire comes along and makes fun of Leibniz, Candide, or the optimist, or optimism, being a kind of parable about a famous professor, Pangloss, the professor of metaphysico-theologico-cosmoronology, moronology. That's supposed to be Leibniz, going around looking at Lisbon and all these other horrendous evils and saying, yes, but it's still the best of all possible worlds. Rhetorically, I think Voltaire wins the debate. He says, everything will be well, that is our hope. So he's still hopeful, but everything is fine today, that is our illusion. So kind of a pessimist about today, hopeful maybe about the future. All Leibniz has to say in response is, well, in some other world, it would have been even worse. Cold comfort for the people of Lisbon, I think. Theoretical optimism then versus theoretical pessimism. Voltaire may be a pessimist, but willing to speak of hope. There in the 19th century was a kind of ongoing debate between a series of hairy German guys about the optimism versus pessimism question. This is, does anybody know? Hegel, not looking too happy, but actually a big-time optimist, thinking that reason is finally going to slowly make everything in conformity with itself, and we will have the absolute and pure rationality. This person, anybody? Schopenhauer, you got it. Yeah, I love that picture of Schopenhauer. Totally a pessimist, thinks that we're all driven by this kind of irrational will to exploit and to self-advantage, though music and art can help us get out of the mood for once in a while. This one, Marx, optimist, kind of, right? So like near term, lots of bad stuff's going to happen thanks to capital and revolutions and so forth. But ultimately, we get to a kind of materialist eschaton in which things will be good for the proletariat in any case. And then Nietzsche, a pessimist, but a joyful one in a kind of strange combination of affect and theoretical assessment of our promise in the future. So this big argument between 19th century German guys and Leibniz, theoretical pessimism combined with lived pessimism. So if you really are pessimistic and think, like Schopenhauer maybe, that things are pretty bad at bottom, maybe you go for music and art to sort of pull you out of the mood once in a while, but mostly you're going to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we all die. Or worse, maybe you're just going to be kind of demoralized and depressed and not do much at all. Nietzsche, of course, thought that it was only hope, this curse from God, that keeps us from all killing ourselves. Could you combine, though, theoretical pessimism with something else? Could we combine it with lived hope, kind of in the mode that we saw Voltaire discussing? And there's where I think we get this other German philosopher in between Leibniz and those 19th century guys, and his key question, which we can now return to, what may I hope? So what does it mean to hope? Having looked at what optimism and expectation are, what can we say about hope? Later Kantians took very seriously Kant's thought that the question about hope is key. This is the rather imposing-looking Ernst Bloch, who wrote 3 huge volumes about the principle of hope in an era when you might think people weren't going to be that hopeful in Germany, and later becomes a leading Marxist figure in the GDR. Bloch says, the work of this emotion, hope, requires people who throw themselves actively into what is becoming, to which they themselves belong. He says many other things in those 3 volumes, but this is a nice little nugget. Hannah Arendt, same time period, both of them smoking. Hannah Arendt, same time period, not a fan of hope. She's a little bit more on the Spinoza, Seneca ambivalence side, thinks, yeah, you know, you could hope that the Jews in Germany were going to be okay, and that could lead to complacency and not bothering to find out what was really happening. In hope, the soul, I'm sure they're fine, overleaps reality. As in fear, it shrinks back from it. So we should hear Spinoza and Seneca in the background there. So still the ambivalence, the debate about hope, even into the 20th century. Cornel West, former colleague, distinguishes between optimism and hope, saying optimism is a notion that there is sufficient evidence that would allow us to infer that if we keep doing what we're doing, things will get better. I don't believe that, but I'm a prisoner of hope. So he does not conflate hope and optimism, hope and expectation in the way that some members of the tradition do. And this is, in a way, the picture that I am interested in further looking at and endorsing. Okay. We looked at what optimism is. Let's just get an account of hope before us. So hopefulness is, again, a kind of general disposition, maybe a kind of virtue, not something I'm going to focus on here. Instead, I want to talk about hope for specific outcomes, just like we did with respect to expectation. So here's a first try, and this is what it seems like we're seeing in Hobbes and some of the others in the tradition. Well, to hope for something is to want it, so an appetite, Hobbes says, but also the opinion of attaining, he says. Maybe that sounds a little too strong, but the belief that it's at least possible seems like a first try look at what hope is. Problem, that doesn't distinguish very well from despair. So consider this story. Fear can hold you prisoner, hope can set you free. Who knows this movie? One of the most watched movies on Netflix and Amazon. Two prisoners. It's actually a Tolstoy story that Stephen King then adapted, that then was taken by Tim Robbins and made into a movie. Tolstoy story about two prisoners, one of whom cannot allow himself to hope. The other says that hope is what motivates him to keep trying to get out, look for pathways to escape whenever possible. But what's interesting is that clearly they both think it's possible. Red, this character, is aware that if we dig behind the toilet, it's at least possible to keep going over many years and get out. They also both really want to get out, let's stipulate. And so it can't be the case that hope is just the desire to get out plus the belief that it's possible, given that the despairing character has exactly those two characteristics as well. So it looks like we need something else to explain, and here obviously I think given the movie and so forth, we have to set aside facts about racial politics of incarceration in America and how that might amplify despair for a certain character rather than another and so forth. So just thinking about the bare fact that they both want it, they both think it's possible, one despairs, the other has hope, and the hope somehow sets him free in the end by crawling out through the sewer. He says, and you can kind of hear the difference in the way they speak. Andy says, I realize that the chance is 1 in a million, but it's possible. Red says, I realize that it's possible, but the chance is 1 in a million. So they express the exact same proposition, but the intoning of it suggests something about the difference between hope and despair. So what's missing, I'm going to skip through this because we're running low on time, but there are a bunch of different efforts to say something about mental imaging or a planning strategy or acting as if or incorporating your desire and belief into your other states and behaviors. So don't worry about any of those details. The point is there's in the literature a bunch of different arguments about what you have to add to belief that it's possible and desire in order to make hope different from despair. And maybe it's not fair for me to just tell you not to pay attention to the competition, but rather to pay attention to my little effort here. So my effort is Thomistic in inspiration. I told you that he has this other non-theological picture of hope, a movement of appetite, so a desire, arouse thy perception of what is agreeable, so what you want, and possible of attainment, so possible rather than probable. Future and arduous, I think we don't need to include in the basic conception of hope, though that will often be the case with respect to the kind of things we're talking about. So the Aquinas definition, I'll put it in my own words, you have to, in order to hope, desire the thing, believe it's possible, and be disposed to focus on that desired outcome under the aspect of its undefeated possibility. So that's a bit of a mouthful, which I'll now try to explain. So we know what desire and believing possible is. What is it to focus on it under the aspect of its undefeated possibility? Well, in cancer wards, we find people being told that they should be the 1%. That doesn't mean they should try to earn $1 billion. It's not that kind of 1%. It means take your diagnosis, even if it's only a 1% chance of surviving, and focus on it as your percent, your possibility, your 1% chance. So against the odds, don't look at what's probable, look at what's possible. Live hopefully with cancer. So you see that in some of the nursing literature, as well as just on posters in cancer wards. So I think this is about right. So it's about focusing, having a disposition to look at the outcome as possible, even if it's incredibly unlikely. So what do I mean by undefeated? So you don't look at it under the aspect of, well, it's possible, but it's really improbable. That's what Red's doing. That's despair, right? Well, it's possible, but it's really improbable. That's the main focus. So that's despair. Or, it's possible. I see somebody's got a pack of cigarettes. I see they're heading outside. I really want to, but I promised my partner I wouldn't do that. So I don't want to. Also, so do I hope to smoke? No, I'm focusing on it as it's possible, but it's prohibited. It's not good. It's not what I want. So I hope not to smoke. Illegal, it's possible you might want to, but it's illegal, so I don't hope to cheat on my taxes. I don't hope to cheat on my spouse either, even if there's some sense in which it, could look good and it's possible. So that's what I mean by undefeated possibility. The possibility isn't defeated by any of these other considerations. And so that's my little kind of focus theory of hope. Kant's, of course, interested in what we may hope. So we'd have to, if we're going to go further, go beyond just talking about what hope is and say something about when each of those conditions are rational. So when's it rational to desire the thing? What is an irrational desire? What is it rational to believe that it's possible versus impossible? That's fairly straightforward. But when is it rational to be disposed to focus on it? That's got a bunch of interesting kind of psychological questions as well. So if focusing on winning the lottery is taking you away from performing your responsibilities at home or leading you to buy a yacht on credit, then maybe that hope looks irrational. It is possible, you really want it, but you shouldn't be focusing on it in that way so often. So there'd be interesting new kind of rational constraints that come in with the focus condition here. Greta joins Hannah Arendt in thinking that certain kinds of hope are irrational because they preclude us from acting. And so it's worth looking at this kind of critique, especially now, circling back to the Anthropocene and animal issues, which we'll end with. So the argument here looks like something like an assumption that, hope is going to be a panacea, it's going to be pablum, it's going to be an opiate, it's going to keep us from genuinely engaging. Sometimes despair, or at least desperation, is what you want in order to sort of radically encourage the kind of action that we need. My sense is that theoretical pessimism, that is, look at the science, the data, the stuff I showed you at the beginning, recognize that we're almost certainly in very big trouble. That gets you the desperation already and should encourage a kind of realism that would lead us to act. I think hope construed properly as the disposition to focus tenaciously on positive possibilities can be an aid to action and a sort of protection, a flak jacket against demoralization that can be debilitating. Okay, so I want to turn back now to climate crisis, but focus more on the animal issue. And I want to do that because climate emissions are sort of linear. There's a sense in which you contribute your little bit and it just contributes to the larger bit that everybody else is contributing. And maybe there are some tipping points that are hard to suss out, but there is some sense in which every little bit counts towards the ultimate emissions quantity that the human race produces. What's interesting about consumer cases, especially when you've got like perishable products like animals, is that by necessity, the supply chains are kind of lumpy or chunky. They're not super well integrated at each level of order and production. You order 5,000 chickens at once, not like one by one, right? Because you've got to incubate the eggs, and the incubator then goes to the producer who's going to raise them in something like this situation, and then ultimately ship them out to restaurants and food producers. So there's a lot of tolerance for waste and buffers in the system that allows you to think, plausibly enough, that your decision today, not just to, forget about freeganism and dumpster diving and roadkillitarianism, like that doesn't make a difference, and I'm actually in favor of most of that. But even purchasing looks like, given the lumpiness situation here and the fact that a lot of food gets thrown out as a result, even purchasing looks like it's very unlikely to make a difference, at least for you as an individual, and maybe for you as an individual over the next 40 years. There's just that many animals in the system. So it didn't reset. I guess when we turned this PowerPoint on initially, it started counting, but it was supposed to reset just as I flipped to this page. But in any case, you can see how quickly it's going. So every second there's 1,000 chickens. I can't even count the number of fish. It's huge numbers of animals being harvested all the time at any given moment. And so you can sort of get a feel for how unlikely it is that you're going to save a chicken by not ordering the patty sandwich that's probably made up of mostly additive and maybe 1/50th of a real chicken. That can lead to a kind of despair or opportunism. So it looks like it's possible, but extremely unlikely that my occasional factory farm chicken purchase is a threshold choice. Typically, it's not wrong to do things that may, but very likely won't cause a significant harm. Getting in a car, getting in a plane, flying a plane. We think these things are okay, even though they may cause a very significant harm. And so maybe it's occasionally okay to go ahead and purchase a factory farm product, even though you're opposed to factory farming in general. You just think it's not going to make a difference, my little purchase, and moreover, it tastes good and I'll get some nutrition out of it. And the spicy mesquite topping in which they deep fry it is just so good. Okay, so that's one approach. I actually kind of like this approach, and I'm tempted by it at certain points. I think you could combine it with serious activism sort of in the rest of your life. So yeah, take the late night fast food spicy barbecue mesquite sandwich and don't worry about it, as long as you're also signing petitions and getting out there and protesting and voting for change, because that's what actually really makes a difference. So one answer to the question, what do you do when you don't make a difference, might be chill. I mean, there's a certain kind of opportunistic spirit here that might be compatible with taking the moral seriousness of factory farming very seriously. So I'm tempted by that, but I'm also tempted by Kant's thought that there might be a way of talking about hope to motivate us, sort of sticking to our moral guns even when we feel like we don't make a difference. Kant says in his religion book, each must, on the contrary, so conduct herself as if everything depended on her. Only on this condition may she hope that a higher wisdom, providence or God, will provide the fulfillment of his or her well-intentioned effort. So you've got to do your moral best, and then you're allowed to hope that somehow someone else or something else or some other mechanism will kick in and help fulfill your well-intentioned effort, bring about some of the results that you were trying to produce. So Kant doesn't think that Kant's not a consequentialist. He doesn't think that we will to produce good consequences, and that's what makes the action good. He thinks we will because it's our duty, the moral law requires it. That's a long story, which we won't get into. But interestingly, he thinks hope is important and possible once we've done what we ought to do for moral reasons. So here, this is on your handout, a little bit complicated, and we'll end with this. He has these moral arguments in each of his three critiques. The moral argument religious version looks like this. So we're acutely aware, and this is applied to factory farming, we're acutely aware of the negative aspects of the factory farm system and morally opposed to its continuation. Let's just assume this as a premise. It would be demoralizing for me not to have hope that my purchasing choices or the choices of those I influence. So, it's sometimes important to think about how you're influencing people, not just on the choices that you're making. But it would be demoralizing not to think that at some point I will make a significant difference with respect to this thing. Especially, I'm like a vegetarian my whole life. I'm like not eating those great chicken sandwiches. I can't keep going unless I can at least hope that somehow this will make some beneficial difference for some animal or some worker. Maybe reduce emissions a little bit. But then the system is so huge, like another 40,000 chickens just died from when I started this sentence. I have to be able to cling to that hope, let's say. Demoralization of this is morally disadvantageous, maybe even disastrous. We feel demoralized. So we still think we ought to do this thing, but we're debilitated and likely to then just go for what's convenient, tasty, and cheap. Given the empirical facts about the systems, this means that there is a serious moral advantage in having hope that the purchasing choices I make or influence make a significant difference. So morally disadvantageous not to be able to hope, morally advantageous to be able to hope. So hope, you might think, gets a kind of moral justification. Other things being equal, it's morally good to hope. You're permitted. What may I hope? You're permitted to hope that you will make at least some difference at some point. Here's where Kant's argument gets kind of wild. So he says, like we've agreed, to have hope for an outcome requires committing, believing, having faith that it's possible. And if something's possible, he says, we need an explanation of how it could be possible. So yeah, maybe some like moral saint can just say, okay, like I don't really need to know how this is possible. I'm just sort of hoping that it's possible. But most of us need some account of how this is possible in order to stave off demoralization and shore up our moral resolve. And he's going to say, well, look, if you're a theist or you're a Buddhist and you believe in something like God, providence, or karma, then you've got a ready-to-hand story about how your actions are being observed by impersonal karmic laws that will then exactly register what you're doing and bring about good results in precise proportion and maybe bad results in precise proportion to what you've done. Kant thinks, he's a theist. He thinks God is seeing the heart and able to know exactly what you're trying to do, what your incentive is, judging, but also, he suggests, maybe helping to bring about your well-intentioned efforts, or at least you can hope for that. So there's this weird, Kant thinks we can't prove God's existence any other way. All those old arguments from the theological tradition don't work. But here's a moral argument. In order to stay moralized and retain hope, we can have not knowledge, but he says we deny knowledge but make room for faith. So we can have faith in the thing that explains the real possibility of the outcome that we're hoping for. That's a bit complicated. Let me go through another version and you'll kind of get the hang of it. So that's the religious version. What about a kind of tipping point or threshold chicken story where you're kind of hoping to be able, despite the long odds, you don't focus on the long odds, you focus on the possibility that you could somehow be at a tipping point or threshold point. So the argument looks the same all the way down to here, hoping for the outcome, committed to it's being really possible. And it seems possible, though extremely unlikely, that you confront a threshold choice at least once over the 50 years of your vegetarianism. And we can believe that that's possible. So here we don't even need recourse to faith. It's actually just sort of epistemically quite clear that you could be on the threshold at some point. And so you can focus if you can. I mean, it's a really, really small probability, just barely possible. But if you're good at focusing mindfully on possibilities in hope, you might be able to sustain your resolve even in that kind of a scenario. So one more example on the cooperative or collective level. There are different ways in which we can be connected to other people. Obviously, we can be connected causally. That's the way most of our connections go. So, maybe it's the case that if I choose to abstain from animal products, my action will cause a significant number of other people to abstain. And if I choose to purchase, then my action will cause a significant number of other people to purchase. Maybe that's how you're connected to other people, but that's because you're an influencer on Instagram, or you're a dictator, or you're at least a parent. You have like some causal connections that really influence other people. But I should speak for myself. I am not an influencer or even a parent for that matter. And I do have some friends, but I don't, think I cause them to do, well, maybe you can have causal effects on other people, but the point is a significant number of other people, most of us won't be able to sort of assume that we can affect. So there's another way of thinking about connections to other people that's a little bit weirder. This comes out of decision theory also. It's part of evidential decision theory. So one thought would be, no, it's not that I cause people to do things, it's that I can take my reasons and the fact that I take them to be good reasons to be such that other people would be likely to take them to be good reasons as well. And so if I choose to abstain, that's strong evidence that a significant number of other people, maybe not here, maybe not now, but someday, somewhere, at some point in the human future, will also see those reasons and will abstain. And if I choose to purchase, that's strong evidence that a significant number of other people somewhere, sometime are likely to purchase. So that's a principle in decision theory that people are unclear about. It's not clear whether that's right, and there's a debate between causal decision theory and evidential decision theory. Kant gives us this argument, a moral argument, according to which we can take things on faith when they help us keep going in the moral law. So here, weirdly enough, is a case, I think, where on faith you take a certain principle about the way in which your action counts as strong evidence regarding what other people will do. And note, you only get the evidence if you do it. So it's not like, oh, I'm about to do it, now I know that everybody else will, so I can be an opportunist. You have to actually go through with it, and then that counts as the evidence that a significant number of other people will as well. Okay, so that's a very weird moral argument, but here we have it, back down to the same place where we were before. What's going to explain the real possibility of you influencing a huge number of people? Well, the existence of one of these connections between my purchasing and those of a significant number of others. That provides, instead of God or providence or karma, that gives an adequate account of how it's really possible for those choices to make a significant difference. But there's probably no strong causal connection for most of us, and so faith in the existence of one of these evidential connections is defeasibly morally justified. So you get the way it works. It's like this. Consider what you need to hope for in order to sustain moral resolve. Form defeasibly justified faith in whatever is required to explain how that hoped-for outcome is really possible. That's the way this little argument is supposed to work. And I find it really fascinating to apply it like this in our kind of daily ethical context, especially when we don't make a difference. So here's just a summary. The religious version has faith in God to help us out. The individualist version has faith, or just focuses in hope on the idea that you will at some point be on the threshold. The collectivist version has faith that your action provides strong evidence for the claim that numerous others will do the same. Isn't this just irrational? Isn't this like crazy wish fulfillment and self-deception? You're taking on faith all these things about the world, like God existing, just in order to keep you going in the moral life? Well, maybe, but Kant doesn't think so. So he thinks it is rational, just insofar as we admit that, look, the justification is not epistemic. It's not like evidence. It's like moral reasons that push us in this direction. So we don't get knowledge. We're not even getting belief. We're just getting faith. But faith is the kind of thing that can really keep us going. So it's this important kind of attitude that goes beyond our evidence. It's about something that is evidentially ambiguous. So if we know that God doesn't exist, then we can't just leap into faith about it. It's not Kierkegaardian in that way. It's much more, Kant is much more like some of the moderate pragmatists who think you can only take on faith what you just don't know, one way or the other. We don't know whether God exists, whether karma exists, whether the strong evidential exists. Then we can take it on faith for these moral reasons. And moreover, the justification is defeasible. If it turns out that someone who believes in God ends up doing all sorts of morally awful things, crusades, inquisitions, that kind of thing, then maybe it looks like we should give it up because the faith is turning out to be morally more problematic than it's worth. Okay, I think I'm going to stop and not expose you to Stuart Brand's tragic optimism. So he just basically says, be an optimist about the long future, even if there's some tragic stuff coming short term. I'm less of a fan of tragic, or I'm sort of curious whether tragic optimism ends up being much different from what I'm into, which is hopeful pessimism. So let's take really seriously the fact that we're in big, big trouble, that we need to change our behaviors, and we probably won't. But let's also not descend into lived pessimism or complete despair. If we learn to focus in hope on at least these small possibilities and maybe take on faith what would be required to make them come about, then perhaps we still, as prisoners of hope, end up retaining our moral resolve, even in the face of some pretty dire circumstances. A threshold chicken with Emily Dickinson's hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Thank you. Sure, yeah.
Who's got a question?
Thank you so much. Really thought-provoking. Can you talk a little bit more about the line 6 on the thing when and I see where you're kind of going at the end, so I'm trying to gather your the direction where you were heading. I think, but when it is irrational to do the right thing because you know that basically the rest of humanity or the vast majority of humanity is not. What is the? Can you talk a little bit more about what the rationale for hope in such cases are? I mean, to sustain from eating meat, to sustain from buying products made with child labor, even to vote is irrational in that same sort of logic. Why do any of it then?
Wait, so this line here?
No, your line, the number 6.
In all of these arguments?
Reasonable, I can't remember how you put it, but there's a reason, it's reasonably possible, or...
to have hope requires a commitment to its being really possible?
Yes, yeah. So in many of these things that we do as humans, you know that most other people, it's whether it's collective action problem or game theory or just, patterns of human behavior, everybody's not going to give up meat, everybody's not going to be nice, everybody's not going to vote. Yeah. Talk more through the ethics of why we should still do the right thing.
So the arguments were about me having a significant effect given my sort of lifetime of choices. And so that's supposed to be really possible, if not probable. That's why it was important to distinguish between expectation or optimism and mere hope. So mere hope just requires the belief that it's possible. And it looks like, you could be on the threshold at some point. You could influence other people in ways that you're not aware of, such that a significant difference is made. I wasn't trying to suggest that this gives us hope for like a utopian future or that it's all going to work out well in the end, although Voltaire did say that, I guess. I was focusing in a kind of the spirit of daily ethics, just on like whatever else is going to happen in the distant future, I would like my efforts to make some sort of positive difference. What's required in order to at least continue to hope for that? But yeah, it'd be a larger and interesting question to think about what would be required to sustain hope that it will all work out well in the end. There, I think the theists have an advantage. So I don't think you're going to be able to motivate theism with this, but I think if you are a theist, then that is a nice thing to have. So that looks like a view according to which it all works out well in the end. Maybe Marxism has a kind of eschatology like that. Hegel has a view like that. But if we're sort of just looking at the naturalistic world around us and trying to come up with something, it's hard to. I'm definitely not optimistic. I'm just clinging to hope. Yeah. Yeah, so that's like the Greta Thunberg concern, right? The Hannah Arendt concern. There's a really important movement called Afro-pessimism that is also opposed to talk of hope for that very reason. So they've thought that, in some sense, like the Martin Luther King Jr., Cornel West, Barack Obama side of things has invoked hope in ways that were powerful, but ended up feeling a bit like an opiate. And Martin Luther King Jr. is often talking about the long arc of history and maybe about the afterlife or something. And the Afro-pessimists think like, no, that stuff doesn't get us anywhere. We need pessimism combined with desperation, and hope is a bit of a distraction. I think Greta thinks that as well, like these people sitting around talking about hope. So I guess my effort here was to suggest that there's a kind of hope, namely this account I was trying to give you, that looks like it answers that question, because what you do is focus in really sort of concertedly on the possibility in such a way that you inevitably start looking for pathways, or you're at least disposed to pathways when they open up. And you're also likely going to then move in that direction insofar as you think you can. So it's the kind of hope that Andy has in the movie. So I guess, yeah, there's a kind of pie in the sky, Pollyanna hope. It's like, well, I'm sure it'll all be fine. That can be debilitating or just make you lazy. I think it's really important that Kant says, first you have to act and act as though everything was up to you. Only then may you hope that God comes in and helps you out. And I think that's the right way to think about hope in this context as well.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll go with a more daily ethics type of question here. So when you are up against the wall and you're making decisions and you're not really sure whether they're going to make much of a difference, do you actually use this logic, or do you have another source for maintaining effort? Do you have another reason for maintaining effort when it looks like it won't make a difference?
Let me introspect. I think there are times when I feel opportunistic and will say, like, this looks like this food's probably going to be thrown out. I'm in a rush, it's late at night or whatever, and so I will engage in that kind of reasoning sometimes, and I think it's defensible. There is a temptation to kind of go too far with it, I think. I think that I do try to perform this kind of mindful meditation on possibility in an effort to, whatever the possibility in question is in an effort to shore up resolve. So when I'm confronting, like, I could do this and I know I ought to, but gee, I'd really like to be doing, I do start to implement some of this in my daily effort. I was raised religious, and so I think I still also have, whether or not I'm sort of committed to it, there's still a feeling that there's some record keeper keeping track, even if no one is. Like, I think there's still that feeling in my psychology, and maybe someone is. But I think being brought up with that feeling that even if nobody is noticing, someone is noticing, and it's going to matter later. That's like embedded in a certain way. And who knows, maybe the AI is noticing and our phones are keeping track of everything we do. And so, some combination of those things, yeah. But I'm by no means a saint in these contexts.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there another one?
So I had a quick question about whether you think that by associating hope with faith and religion becomes this...
I couldn't hear that part.
Do you think that by associating hope with faith and religion, that it becomes almost this intangible idea rather than something that can be used to promote action?
No, I mean, I think like religion is one of the great motivating forces in human life and history. I mean, all the good and terrible things that have been done in the name of religion have changed everything, such that, as I was suggesting, even if you're no longer sure exactly what, I think of myself as not a believer, but a hoper. I mean, I still in some sense hope that a lot of that stuff is true and would like that hope to be a legitimate religious stance in some way. So I think, like, if you're really committed, if you have faith or knowledge that some of these things are true, that there is a karmic system, that there is a God, that can be a massive, like, shoring up of action and dedication. even when it looks like you're not making any consequential difference. So yeah, I think religion can do bad things by way of causing people to act. I do think there is the opiate worry, oh, God's going to just work it all out. But for the most part, I think religion is a motivator, often to very good things, sometimes to very bad things.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Chignell.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to everyone for joining, both in Stackhouse Theater and on the live stream. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks for Chantal Bilodeau's Mud Center lecture. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise. Yeah.